Today is the final message in a series from the book by Ellsworth Kallis. If experience is such a good teacher, then why do I keep repeating the course? We've been through a number of experiences, all of which are ones we're going to face and at some time or another in our lives. Kallis points out that there's an overlooked source of experience that we need to pay attention to. He puts it this way: among the courses in life experience, there's one bargain course in the school. The teacher is usually pleasant. How pleasant? Well, he or she pays your tuition. You can't ask for a better deal, can you? One wonders why this class isn't more enthusiastically attended. I suppose it's because it calls for a high degree of humility, which is in itself a painful price. The teacher is other people, people who have already paid the price of experience or accumulated the knowledge helpful and necessary. Why should we reinvent the wheel? If someone else has already taken a particular course, it's far less expensive to learn from them than to insist on doing it all ourselves and paying the full tuition. Kallis reminds us that the Bible is full of mentoring relationships. We think, first of all, of Jesus teaching those disciples, spending 2 or 3 years intensely every day with them. We also think of Moses teaching Joshua, one of the next generation. Prophet Elijah mentoring his successor Elisha. Dr. Kallis takes us to Exodus 18, which Lou has just read you a portion of, where Moses is now a seasoned leader of Israel. But he learns an important lesson from his father-in-law, Jethro. If anyone might have been justified in depending on his own counsel, Kallis writes, it would have been Moses. He is still looked upon as the first great deliverer for bringing the nation of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. He has a special place in the history of the law because of his association with the Ten Commandments. After all, we look at the book of Exodus, we see that it's Moses that goes up on Mount Sinai. It's Moses that dwells in direct relationship to God. It's Moses who receives the tablets of the law. Well, the experience here in Exodus 18 occurred not long after the Israelites had escaped from Egypt. When you have thousands of people living together, you inevitably have disputes. And Moses had to deal with these disputes, and it was an almost endless job. You can imagine, someone complains that his neighbor in the next tent is disturbing the peace. He's playing his harp too late at night. All day long, hour after hour, Moses listens to the arguments and the points of view. And all of that takes time and energy. And because there are so many people to be heard, people had to stand in line for hours, waiting their turn. It was a miserable system, exhausting for Moses, and frustrating for the people. Those of you who saw the great film Lincoln remember that it portrayed something that's no longer true at the White House. Back in the day of Abraham Lincoln, you could go into the White House and stand on a stairway for an hour or two because you want to talk directly to the president. So you see, this kind of a system of the leader hearing the complaints and the concerns of everyone is a system that existed even in our government not all that long ago. And then comes Moses' father-in-law, a man named Jethro. He's been observing what's been happening between Moses and all these people who seem to need to be heard. He's watched this day-long scene, and then quietly and respectfully, he gives his son-in-law Moses a suggestion. You're wearing yourself and the people out. Why not set up a series of others who can judge? Let them deal with the cases and refer only the most difficult ones to you. That way, everyone will get quicker justice, and you'll have time to do other things. I jokingly said to Judy this past week, the first time management expert was Jethro, the father of Moses. He looked at the situation and he saw this isn't efficient, this isn't working well, this is frustrating. Now, we don't know much about Jethro. He was probably a fairly regular guy, but his advice was invaluable. Now, before we continue, let's consider several things that we've learned about human character. When someone gives us advice, we often, first of all, consider the source of the advice before we listen to what it is they're telling us. Mark Twain had a saying that's become very familiar to all of us: familiarity breeds contempt. Now think about it for a moment. Jethro, who Moses knows a lot better than we do, this is just my father-in-law. What does he know? Familiarity breeds contempt. That might have been the way Moses could have responded. He might have just dismissed the counsel because, after all, it's only my father-in-law. Moses might well have thought to himself, what does Jethro know? He's just a humble shepherd in Midian. I find it both sad and interesting that people will travel many miles to hear a noted speaker. They'll shell out money to seek the advice of experts while they deliberately ignore often wise advice of family members and friends that are offered for free. You see, they don't have the credential. They're not that important expert. So why pay attention to them? Before we get too wrapped up in this considering the source, we may want to remember that God sends us people like Jethro with solutions to our problems. And we need to have an open and listening ear. Some, particularly in the counseling field, claim that if one is paying for the advice, they're more likely to take it seriously. And that the counsel that is very wise but free is often dispensed with or ignored. Jethro not only identified the problem that Moses was facing. Notice again there in Exodus chapter 18, he gives him very clear, tangible, practical advice as to how to solve it. Now comes the vital moment. What is Moses going to do with this precious gem of advice? The big question, as Callis puts it, is this: would Moses be willing to learn from someone else? Moses could easily have huffed and puffed and said, "Dear father-in-law, you've probably forgotten that I'm the graduate of the finest university in Egypt. Furthermore, I challenged the Pharaoh in a series of public debates, and I won. If you don't mind my asking, have you ever led a group of slaves out of bondage through the waters of the sea and organized them into a nation? Specifically, if you've missed my point, if I ever want your advice, I'll ask for it." Now, that could have been the response of Moses. But that isn't the way he responded. The story has a good ending. He took his father-in-law's advice. And if you read ahead in the Old Testament, you discover that he developed what we would call the justice system, a series of judges and elders that took the place of hearing the disputes and settling the differences. Be willing to learn from unlikely teachers. It's very important. In verse 24, we have the response of Moses. Moses gave heed to the voice of his father-in-law and did what he had said. Moses chose an able group of men out of all of Israel and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And they judged the people at all times. And the hard cases they brought to Moses, but any small matter they decided themselves. Have you ever noticed how the court system works here in the United States? Barbara seems to be totally mystified by it, right? She's shaking her head this way. There are a series of local courts, and then there are superior courts, and then there are state supreme courts, and then there are federal courts, and then there is the Supreme Court. So you see what's happened is we have echoed this system, and who do we have to thank for it? Moses? No. Jethro, his father-in-law. Interesting, isn't it? So we do need to learn from those who have advice for us, whoever they are and wherever they come from, whether they're an expert or not. Callis writes of Moses, he was someone who often got his direction straight from the Almighty, but he didn't allow his level of spirituality to blind him to the ability God had invested in others around him. He had the humility and the good sense to know that God might well speak to him through other human beings, including a human being who, it might appear, knew less than he did. Lou read to you from Psalm number 1. It's about the company we keep. A folksy way to put the message in Psalm number 1 is to say if we hang out with people who always get into trouble, who are on an evil path, we'll wind up there too. Back in the late 1970s, there was a very striking documentary that I remember seeing. It was about 1979. The documentary was called Scared Straight. It took the viewer into a maximum security penitentiary in New Jersey, along with a nervous group of youth offenders who were ordered by the court to meet with a group of inmates who had committed crimes that would keep them in that penitentiary for the rest of their lives. What I found moving about this documentary was that this group of hardened prisoners shared very openly from the heart with those teenagers about what would happen to them if they kept on going the wrong way. The convicts did not argue that they were there, placed there wrongly, that they were innocent. They said, in effect, listen, you young punks, and take a lesson from us. If you need to turn your lives around and head the other way, or you will wind up in a place like this for the rest of your lives. So the lesson of Psalm number 1 is the company we keep has a great deal to do with where we wind up. The psalmist reminds us that the example of the wicked can teach us vital lessons about failure that can protect us from needless pain. Whether you have a lot of education or not, all of us are graduates in some degree or another from that famous school who doesn't have a football team called the School of Hard Knocks, right? That's why the title of the book is what it is. If experience is such a good teacher, why do I keep repeating the course? That's what these lifelong criminals were saying to these young youth offenders. Don't go down the path I've gone down. Learn from my mistakes and save yourself a lot of pain and a lot of grief. Our society generally does not acknowledge that important lessons can be learned from people who have experienced failure. The world seems to be dazzled by success and worships the ones they call winners. Whenever you hear someone refer to others as winners and losers, beware of their advice. Generally, they lack wisdom, godly or otherwise. Callis admonishes us to ignore lessons, not to ignore lessons from failure. He writes, "In my own profession of many years, parish ministry, I have noticed that some are quick to offer advice. Some who are quick to offer advice are those whose own track records are dismal. In such cases, I have profited not from what the person has told me, but from what I know of their mistakes and from the gap between their intentions and their achievements. We learn from 4 examples as well as good ones. As well as the convicts who teach the young criminals in the making of the documentary Scared Straight, there are others who share precious lessons from their failures. I think particularly of probably the most famous rehabilitated criminal in American society, and that's Charles Colson, who was at the pinnacle of worldly power when he was an official in the White House and was counsel of the president during the Watergate scandal. Sadly, few in Richard Nixon's circle came out of that experience changed for the better in any way. But Chuck Colson, in his autobiographical book Born Again, and his follow-up book Life Sentence, speaks movingly of the way God used that dreary circumstance to mold a once power-hungry attorney into a dedicated servant of Christ. There are teachers everywhere, and this is part of what Callis wants us to understand. It was Isaac Newton, by the way, who said that we stand on the shoulders of giants, referring to the accomplishments and the achievements of other people who've gone before us. We stand in that stead in what you and I enjoy today. There are countless generations and individuals who have an important lesson to give us all kinds of blessings and benefits today. From my own observations of people, I'm convinced that there are those who only want to learn from the present, and they seldom have any respect or concern for the past. They look for today-only teachers. Fortunately, there are others who intuitively have a respect for those who've gone before them, in what we call in Christianity the saints of old. We can learn not only from the people who cross our paths in person, but also from those we meet through books and history. C.S. Lewis said that one of the major factors that influenced him to renounce atheism and to accept Christianity was the knowledge that some of the historical personalities who he admired happened to be Christian believers. If we human beings would be humble enough and wise enough to learn from history and life stories, every generation would be an improvement on the previous one. Psalm 119 tells us there is one teacher who is above all, and that's God himself, who has dwelt with thy servant, O Lord, according to thy word. Teach me good judgment and knowledge, for I believe in thy commandments. Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep thy word. Thou art good, and doest good, and teach me thy statutes. The godless besmear me with lies, but with my whole heart I keep thy precepts. Their heart is gross like fat, but I delight in thy law. It's good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes. The law of thy mouth is better for me than thy thousands of gold and silver pieces. Some people teach us such eloquent and moving lessons, it is as if God himself was speaking to us through them. There's a story that has always moved me that Richard Weimer passes along, because I think I've met people who literally were like the central character in this story. This is the story of a man named Carl. Carl was 87 years old. He lived in the same neighborhood for over 50 years. It once had been a nice neighborhood, but now it was run down, full of random violence and gangs and drug activity. The local church advertised for volunteers to take care of the gardens behind the pastor's house. Carl signed up for the job. But then an event occurred that would have crushed many people. People who were not as strong as Carl. Carl was finishing watering the garden one day when 3 gang members showed up. He ignored their intimidation and just asked if they'd like a drink of water from the hose. The biggest and the meanest of the gang members answered, "Yeah, sure." The other 2 grabbed Carl and threw him down. They took Carl's retirement watch and his wallet. Carl tried to get up, but he had fallen on his bad leg. He was trying to get up when the minister came running out to help. The minister kept asking Carl if he was okay or if he was hurt as he helped him to his feet. Carl sighed and shook his head. It was just some punk kids. Maybe they'll wise up someday. He bent over and picked up the hose and adjusted the nozzle and started watering again. The minister was concerned and confused as he asked Carl what he was doing. "I need to finish watering the garden," Carl said. "It's been a very dry day." A few weeks later, the gang members returned, and just like the first time, Carl offered them a drink from the hose. Well, they didn't rob him this time. They wrenched the hose away from Carl and soaked him from head to foot with its icy water. When they had finished humiliating him, they sauntered off down the street, yelling insults and curses over their shoulders and falling over each other with the hilarity of what they had done. Carl just watched them. He turned his face toward the warm sun. He calmly picked up his garden hose and he went back to watering the garden. Summer was quickly turning into fall. Carl was tilling the garden one day when he heard someone come up behind him. He stumbled and fell into some evergreen branches. He struggled again to regain his footing and turned to see the gang member holding out his hand. Well, Carl braced himself for another attack. "Don't worry, old man," said the gang leader. "I won't hurt you." The young man spoke softly. He was still holding out his tattooed and scarred hand to Carl. He helped Carl get up, and he pulled a crumpled bag from his pocket. "What's this?" asked Carl. "It's your stuff," the gang member answered. "I brought your stuff back. It's all here, even the money that was in your wallet." "Why would you help me now?" Carl asked. The boy shuffled his feet. He looked embarrassed and uncomfortable. And finally, he said, "Because I learned something from you. We picked on you because you were old. We knew we could get away with it. But every time we came, instead of yelling and fighting back, you just tried to give us a drink of water. You didn't hate us back because we hated you. You just kept showing us love." He stopped for a moment, And then he went on. I couldn't sleep after we stole your stuff, so I decided to bring it back. He paused for another awkward moment, not knowing how to proceed. I guess it was my way of thanking you for straightening me out. With that, the gang member walked away. Carl carefully opened the bag with his hands. He put his retirement watch back on his arm. When he opened his wallet, he checked for his wedding photo and gazed lovingly at the young bride smiling back at him. Carl died one day that winter, right after Christmas. In spite of the weather, his funeral was well attended. The minister noticed a tall young man sitting quietly in a far corner of the church. At the service, the minister spoke of Carl's garden. Do your best, he said, and make your garden as beautiful as you can. We will never forget Carl and his garden. The following spring, another flyer went out asking for another volunteer to work in the garden. It read, "Someone needs to take care of Carl's garden." A few days later, the minister heard a knock at his office door. He opened the door. He saw a pair of scarred and tattooed hands holding the flyer. "I believe this is my job," the owner of those hands said, "if you'll have me." The minister recognized him as the same young man who had returned Carl's watch and wallet. He knew that Carl's kindness had turned this boy's life around. The minister just handed him the keys to the workshed and said, "Go take care of Carl's garden and honor him." The young man went to work without a word. Over the next several years, this young man tended the garden just the way Carl had. During that time, he went to college and he got married and became a prominent member in the community. But he never forgot the promise that he had made to honor Carl's memory. He kept the garden as beautiful as he could and thought that Carl would have approved. One day he approached the minister and explained that he could no longer take care of the garden. He said with a shy but happy smile, "My wife had a baby boy last night, and she's bringing him home on Saturday." "Congratulations," said the minister as he took the keys to the garden shed. "It's wonderful. By the way, what's the baby's name?" Come on. We'll see who's awake. Yeah, it was Carl, of course. Thanks to the dedicated efforts of a host of people, school teachers, coaches, social workers, doctors, pastors, and many others, a very unselfish and dedicated group of people have set out to encourage and help younger generations to find their way in life. We call those people mentors, and they have a life-changing impact on the people they teach these kind of lessons to. The story of Carl reminds us that some of them do not so much impart wisdom in some intellectual way as simply teaching by example. God bless the church and the world for the Carls who teach not so much by what they say as by what they do. Those parting words of Paul in Philippians 4:8 and 9 are, according to many New Testament scholars, his farewell words not only to the people at Philippi, but to all Christians. He knew his life would be soon coming to an end. So here's what he said. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And then these astounding words in the 9th and final verse. And they're on the front of your bulletin, lest you forget. Keep on doing the things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. We often hesitate with that second verse. We know that all those virtues are wonderful, but we wonder to ourselves, is the example I'm setting one that is that clear? Let's pray. Lord, through these last several months, we would ask that these various lessons, these various life experiences, would be ones that we continue to learn from. May we be a little more aware today that there are people around us, neighbors, friends, younger generations, who are struggling with some of these same experiences, struggling to learn these same lessons. May we have the care and the courage to offer the advice when we know it might be helpful, and to make the example that we know will change a life around us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.